Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Rolling to the River virtual presentation. My name is Heather, and I am the Niagara River Project Assistant, so I work on the Niagara River Remedial Action Plan. Today, I am going to be talking to you about watersheds, and we all live and work in the Niagara Peninsula watershed. Do you know what a watershed is? A watershed is defined as an area of land where all of the surface water drains to the same place, whether it be a creek, a river, a lake, or an ocean. All the precipitation, such as snow or rain, that falls on the watershed flows into the same point. So I'm going to put up a map to show you the Niagara Peninsula watershed. So on this map, you can see that's what our watershed looks like. So all within that area, there's a couple different points that everything ends up flowing into Lake Ontario, but you have Lake Erie, then you have Lake Erie that flows into the Niagara River and goes down into Lake Ontario. So I'm talking to you from very close to Lake Ontario today. So today I am going to tell you a story about how pollution travels across our watershed. So I'm going to show you my enviroscape. So as you can see here, we have our landscape. So we have our farm over here, and we have some houses, some roads. So for my story, it's going to be a sunny Saturday morning in the Niagara Peninsula watershed. And it's actually garbage day today. So everyone in this neighborhood has put out their trash, their compost, and their recycling at their curb for pickup. But it's a really windy day. So some of their trash gets blown around and ends up on the sidewalk. It ends up on the street. Sometimes we see trash in a natural area because it might have got blown around. And over on this side of our farm, we have our farmer, and she's growing us some cows, and she's growing us some wheat, so we can enjoy a delicious cheesy pasta for dinner. And in order to keep the bugs from eating her crops, she needs to add some pesticides. So we're going to put that there. And over on this side of the farm, we have the cows. And the cows have escaped through a broken fence, and they're over here playing in the creek. Now, cows are big animals, and they poop a lot. So they've made a huge mess over here of poop. And speaking of poop, some of the neighborhood people in the neighborhood took their dogs for a walk this morning, and they forgot to clean up after them. So we have a little bit more poop over here. So driving down the street, we have our construction worker, and he didn't realize that his truck was actually leaking oil and gas. So, we have some oil and gas that's ended up on the street. And then over here, we have a chemical plant, chemical factory working very hard, but they haven't properly set up their chemical waste system. So unfortunately, their chemical waste is dumping right into a nearby stream. So over here, up on this hill here, the city wants to make a really nice view for some hikers. So they cut down some trees. And without the trees, it actually leaves the soil exposed and it doesn't have any roots to hold it. So this is going to be our loose soil over here. And then in this neighborhood here, we have a gardener, and he wants his lawn to be beautiful and green, but he wants it done really fast. So he uses some fertilizer and some herbicide, and he uses actually more than the instructions suggest because he's in a hurry. So there's going to be some herbicide, some fertilizer, and a lot. Okay. All right. And there's actually a weather warning that it's going to be a really chilly night. So the city takes some salt and puts it on the streets because we want to protect drivers from driving on icy roads. So there's our salt. But that afternoon, there's a huge rainstorm. And this rainstorm washes all of this pollution right into the creeks, right into the rivers, eventually into the lakes. And now our water is polluted. So this water here that we depend on, that our plants and animals depend on, it has all that stuff that I talked to you about. It has salt, it has soil, it has poop, it has fertilizer, it has garbage. From that rainstorm, it brought everything in the watershed right into that lake. So what is our solution for pollution? What can we do? Well, farmers can use best management practices to keep things on the farm away from and safe from the lake, so they can make sure that their fences are working, for example, so that their pigs, their chickens, their cows can't make it all the way to the creek and they can't make that mess in the creek. We as citizens can make sure that we clean up after our pets. We can make sure that if it's a really windy day, maybe we wait until right before the garbage comes to put our garbage out on the curb. We can do a garbage cleanup with our friends, our family, our schools, and that removes that garbage from the environment and puts it in the proper place so that it can't end up in the streams or the creeks or the rivers or the lakes. We can also make sure if we're going to be using pesticides or herbicides that we follow the instructions, because the instructions tell us how to do it safely. And in the best case scenario, we don't use them at all. We can also leave lots of natural space with plants to make the soil very stable. So if the plants are there and the roots are there, it's holding all that soil in. And if you think about it as well, if you have grass and you have a sidewalk, which one do you think that the water is going to soak into more quickly or at all? Probably the grass. So if you have a huge rainstorm and the rain hits the grass, well, it hits the grass and then it slowly soaks in, or it hits the trees and then it slowly trickles down the trees and goes and seeps into the ground. But if you have pavement or a driveway, when it rains, that water gets going really, really fast. And when it's going fast and there's a lot of it, that's actually how it picks up that pollution and moves it. So we can leave a lot of natural areas. That would help us as well. And so now you know what a watershed is. You've seen the demonstration of how pollution can move across the landscape. And it's time for questions. So I'm going to move you guys down over here so I can see the chat and see what kind of questions you have. Thank you so much for listening. So, Question from Mrs. Bridges' class at Lakeview School. Is a watershed natural or can it be man-made? So I'm not a watershed expert, but what I think is that it basically a watershed is if you had any sort of bridge directing water. That's the concept of what a watershed is. So in our watershed, it's natural and it directs all that water. So I think that you could make something like a watershed, but our watershed is naturally made. And a question from Mrs. Bridges' class. How big or small can a watershed be? And I don't think there's any limit, because if all the water is in a small area being directed to one source, or it just so happens that the land has formed so a huge area, all the water is being directed to one source. These are both still defined as a watershed. Question from William. Could bad water kill animals? It could, yeah, absolutely. So one thing that happens with water that it has too much fertilizer in it or too much animal waste in it, is there's so much nutrients in that water now that there creates an imbalance in the ecosystem. And there's algae in there that love that nutrients. So they grow like crazy in that with all that extra nutrients. And then they actually take all the oxygen out of the water. So the fish that live there and need that oxygen end up dying because there isn't enough oxygen for them. So it definitely could happen. Or fertilizer or the salt that we saw, the salt off the road could make the water too high in salt. So the amphibians, the frogs, the turtles, the fish that live in the water, it's too salty for them and they could die, yes, or maybe not do as well. Maybe their eggs don't hatch, that kind of thing. From Mrs. Reynolds' grade 4 class, are wetlands a part of a watershed? Absolutely. Yes, they are definitely a part of a watershed. Question from Mrs. McGowan's grade 3 class. Are pesticides and herbicides bad for the earth? Why do they sell them at stores? That's a good question. So pesticides and herbicides have instructions on them. Excuse me. Got a frog in my throat. They have instructions on them that it's supposed to let the user apply them in a way that's safe for the earth. They sell them at stores because I think right now that's how we know how to control pests. So as much as pesticides, we've heard a lot probably about the damage that pesticides can do, but pesticides actually do a lot for us. So when we have, let's say I'm a farmer and I'm farming corn, it's not very good for me and my livelihood if pests come and ruin all my crops, because no one wants to eat corn with bugs on it and then I can't sell it anymore. So it's definitely a delicate balance with how we're using our pesticides, how much, and how it affects the earth. But that's a great question. Question from Mrs. Hot's class. Sorry if I mispronounced that. How does the water get clean again after all the pollution goes into it? So there's a couple different ways. So we have the Niagara region. They clean our drinking water for us. So they have a wastewater treatment plant that cleans out all that pollution and makes it safe for us to drink again. And there's also different ways that we clean pollution. For example, like an oil spill, we've had to clean those up, and I don't know exactly how they clean them up, but I have heard this really cool invention where someone wanted to use human hair, like big mats of human hair, because human hair, I guess, collects oil. So there's there's actually opportunity for all of you students to brainstorm, how are we going to clean this water up? How are we going to get all this pollution out of it? And that's something that you could totally brainstorm and think about. Question for Miss Bigford, grade 3 class. Can the oil hurt plants and animals? Yes, it can actually. Yeah. So it's not the oil that I showed you in our demonstration isn't the same kind of oil that you'll see. I don't know if you've ever seen those commercials with Dawn soap where they have the little duckling and it's covered in oil. That's like a big ocean oil spill that happened. But similarly, if oil got into the lake and let's say you were a fish and it got all over your gills and that's how you breathe, then you can't breathe because you have oil all over where you breathe. Question from Tony. Is pollution a local problem? A local problem of can it travel long distances? Well, as we saw in our demonstration, that pollution can travel long distances, and it can even travel longer distances than that. So plastic pollution that we might see here in our lakes could actually end up in the ocean, and that's really far away, but it can travel a really long distance. Question from Mr. Kovac's class. What can students do to help at school to help clean up the watershed? Students can do garbage cleanups, because if you take the garbage out of the environment, then there's no way that it can end up in those lakes and creeks and rivers and streams. So garbage cleanups are great. You can maybe do some gardening with your school, planting plants, especially native plants. That really helps keep the health of our watershed up, because plants can filter water and make it cleaner before it ends up in the creeks or the lakes or the streams. So that's all the time we have for now. Thank you so much for your questions. I really appreciate it. I hope that you had a great time listening and that you learned something, and all the other questions that come in, we'll do our best to answer them through email. And I hope you guys have a great rest of your day.